Okay, we have one more session to go before we have lunch, but it's going to be an interesting presentation, I think. Shedding Skin, Turla's Fresh Faces, done by Kurt Baumgartner and Mike Scott from Kaspersky Labs. Gentlemen, take it.
All right, thank you, Ricard. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending today. We're here to talk about Turla activity that we've been seeing in 2018. Some of it is preceded by activity and informed by activity we've been seeing in 2016, 2017. So we'll talk about some of that activity as well, but we're focused on the here and now. I'm Kurt Baumgartner. I'm a principal security researcher with Kaspersky Labs Global Research and Analysis team. I've been part of the team since 2010, and I'm happy to introduce a new member of the team, Mike Scott.
Yeah, I'm Mike Scott. I'm fairly new to the team, middle of this year. Previous to that, I spent about a dozen years in the US defense industry doing network defense and incident response, and basically decided that I got tired of working nights and weekends and on actors' time and switched over to the threat intel and threat actor tracking side, and I've been doing that for about 7 years now. So.
All right. So yeah, we're here today to talk about a large threat actor. They're capable, well-resourced, and they go back decades. We're going to, again, talk about their activity in 2018, but we're going to sort of talk about clusters of activity. Turla is so large, they have many different things going on at once, and really this talk will focus on some of their JavaScript or KopiLuwak and iced coffee activity, and then also what we've been seeing as far as Carbon, Mosquito, Turla, and some of how it ties together related to backdoor we called WhiteBear. So this is the sort of the larger mess that Turla is. And again, we're going to pick and choose a few things that we're going to focus on related to 2018 activity. This is not Turla. This is other stuff, whether it's the Dukes, Sophisy, other Russian-speaking APT. If you're paying attention to the news today, you may have forgotten that there is another Russian-speaking APT called Turla. But Sophisy and these guys are somewhat separate, and we have an interesting finding about how separate they are from Turla in 2018. The targeting that we're seeing, you can view this map if you can't really read what's going on here. On SecureList, we've got the link there for you. But generally, Turla has been targeting both remote and local organizations, foreign affairs organizations, diplomatic organizations, government-related, scientific and technical organizations all over the world. And this is simply what we've been seeing towards the end of 2017 and 2018. Others, we've seen other public reporting on this group. So in some cases, the problem is bigger than our visibility, than what we're seeing. And we'll point that out as this goes on. So related to Turla's PE malware in 2018, we've been seeing new versions of Carbon. And this is unusual. This was surprising to me. We see Carbon is something that we mentioned back in 2014 as a part of the Epic Turla operation. We posted on it back in, again, 2014, and we found multiple components to this framework. It's a backdoor framework. The newest versions in 2018, we see a new orchestrator, version 3.8.2, and a new injected object, 4.0.5. Some of the new functionality that they bring with it have to do with anonymous pipes and interprocess communications. So they are building and modifying on something that's years old. It's interesting that we also happen to be seeing Meterpreter and other open source tools being used by these guys to distribute and push the new versions of Carbon. And in particular, we're seeing it in Central Asia. They're very selective about how or what systems they're pushing it to. So it may be, so it's just rare to find this framework in the wild. We'll talk a little bit more about Mosquito. It's a modified version of Comrat that we continue to see. There's a lot of activity from these guys and from this operation in particular throughout the world in 2017 and 2018. And again, we're seeing Meterpreter and open source tooling being bundled into this Mosquito package. And again, it's remote and local organizations that are foreign affairs related and diplomatic in these regions. And then finally, we'll reflect a little bit on WhiteBear, sort of their initial scripting efforts related to spear phishing, and then sort of the JScript they're building into their tooling.
Okay. Yeah, as Kurt mentioned, Turla has used a lot of JScript and JavaScript in some of their previous tools, but Iced Coffee, aka Shirami, which some people, and including the actors, that's what they call it. That was kind of their first foray into fully JavaScript backdoors. These initial samples were dropped by a weaponized RTF and then some macro office docs and XLS. The macro code was very similar to what was dropping White Atlas, also known as Skipper. So that was kind of our early way to say, hey, this looks a lot like Turla. And then FireEye also blogged 2017, I think, about that 270261 and 27001, which was a privesc that apparently Turla and one other crime war actor were the first, had the only access to that 0 day when it came out, and one of those was used to drop Shirami. What's interesting is the macro code in that they actually added a beacon capability in the macro itself. So when the macro runs, it generates a little bit of system information and then sends a beacon up to a C2 server. And we're kind of hypothesizing that perhaps that was a way to see, kind of gauge their delivery, like the effectiveness of their exploitation and possibly the gullibility of their targets. If the macro ran, and they got the initial C2, then they'd know that the macro ran, and the beacon was successful. But if then the system never checked in fully with the Iced Coffee backdoor, then either it was detected or it failed or whatever reason. So kind of an interesting tactic that they've started using. That KopiLuwak did the same thing sort of as well. Not a very robust backdoor. I mean, it's fairly not very feature rich. It did a lot of use WMI for collecting a whole bunch of system information that it stored in a big JSON blob, and then uploaded it, encrypted it, and uploaded it to the C2 server. And but then it didn't really have any command functionality per se. It would check into the C2 server, and then depending on the response from the server, it could download additional JavaScript, and then it could use to run, and then send the results back up. But not very feature rich. KopiLuwak, on the other hand, was kind of the next generation, if you will, totally different code. They overlapped in time a little bit, but similar kind of thing, initially dropped by Office docs. Proofpoint actually blogged on one that was dropped by a .NET dropper, and then as we'll talk about later, we saw it dropped by some Office shortcut link files. The macro code, again, was very similar to the White Atlas Skipper stuff, but then they had actually added some new tricks to it, a new XOR routine, and some other things for decoding the payload. The JavaScript itself is much more obfuscated than Iced Coffee was. And the way it works is it actually drops the JavaScript to disk and then sets up persistence, and then it actually writes another level of JavaScript that's run at runtime, is decrypted with RC4 and runs in memory. So it makes it a little bit harder to do forensics and whatnot. If you only have the JavaScript, you have to know the RC4 key to actually run it. This one does use WMI a little bit for system profiling, but it basically runs this huge giant block of net user, ipconfig, all the typical kind of host and network forensics activity. It writes it to a file, encrypts it, sends it up to the C2 server, and then immediately deletes it. So similar kind of tactic to Iced Coffee. It tries to leave a very little footprint on disk and leave very little behind for forensics to discover. KopiLuwak did have, the first version had about, I think, 4 commands that it supported, that it would, based on the response from the C2 server rather. One of it, it could everything was happy, it would just sit there and pause, and it would wait, I think, for like 3 or 4 minutes. It has somewhat randomization, has a little bit of randomization on how long it would wait to beacon again. They could actually tell it to just kill itself and wait until the server reboots, or the system reboots, and then the persistence will kick it on again. If they want it to go quiet for a while, it also had a mode to just fully, remove itself completely and delete all evidence of persistence. And then it also had a command capability similar to ice copy, where it could run, could download files, could download additional scripts, things like that.
All right, lots of scripting. So moving back to Carbon and the Carbon framework, its deployment, really what it looks like. There are a couple of interesting characteristics about Carbon that are unusual. One is its unusually explicit installer. When we see the loader itself, it coincides with the presence of Meterpreter in some form, which is really unusual. You've got a mature, functional, and really interesting code base that they've been using for years alongside Meterpreter, which is an open source, freely distributed Metasploit tool. The Carbon code, when the loader drops other components to disk, it uses the familiar sort of Turla potty mouth error code messages. In this case, when it succeeds, it says, hey, lucky strike. But if they don't obtain privileges to drop files to appropriate locations, they complain, why the F not? And then other error messages continue after that, which is kind of what you expect from Turla. Certainly not a military discipline to how they're deploying and writing code. The loader is SRV or srsvc.dll. That's a file name that's been pretty common across deployments, so that's nothing new. But all the file names, mutex names, everything they bundle into this package that could be used as an indicator has been changing across these minor increments. So you can't really use them from one release to another to detect or identify Carbon. It also suggests that somebody, or that the loader is being run manually and somebody is inspecting the error messages as they're running. So the loader that we were looking at is 621K, or 621,000 bytes. And here are all the file names and internal component names that they've been using, and you can see from earlier versions of Carbon, they usually maintain these older internal names, and they just don't bother to update the internal names when they compile the code and push it out, which is unusual, but that's what they're doing. So I guess one other interesting thing to note about this file listing and what you see on the screen here is that there are multiple injected Carbon libraries. It used to be simply an orchestrator, an encrypted blob, or a config file encrypted with cast 128, and then a transport library injected into a browser, an email client, or IM. But now they've got an additional library, and it's large, or I should say it's smaller than the coinciding code that had been previously released. This is where they're including the anonymous pipes code, the additional stuff that they supplemented the older code base with. So Mosquito is another package and another set of activity that we're seeing globally from Turla. It's focused on diplomatic and governmental organizations. They're very consistent about the target profiling, and they're less consistent about locations in the world where they're delivering it. Something that's not on the slide has to do with their man-in-the-middle techniques. Now, when we originally notified customers and sent out and reported on this activity, we noted that there were man-in-the-middle attacks going on that we suspected. This was late 2016, early 2017. Another report came out towards the end of 2017 reporting on almost the same stuff. So we weren't the only ones seeing it, and this was a bit larger of a problem than we expected. interesting thing about the installers that we had been seeing that would support the hypothesis that these guys are performing man-in-the-middle techniques that are Wi-Fi based have to do with some of the installers gathering and dumping all of the Wi-Fi profiles on the system to an XML file and immediately sending that back to the C2. That's followed up with a collection of IP config information and ARP-A, or all of the MAC addresses that the system has access to on the network. So they'll know what the gateway MAC should look like, and they'll know what the gateway Wi-Fi password should be. So ARP flooding or tools like Silica or Pineapples can help you perform man-in-the-middle techniques if you ever lose access or perhaps hit another organization or location from the same organization. So in all likelihood, we suspect and we have data that suggests Wi-Fi-based man-in-the-middle techniques are going on and not necessarily ISP-level man-in-the-middle techniques. Other interesting things we saw with Mosquito and the sort of custom Comrat modules that they've been delivering is that now they also are bundling in Metasploit code. It looked like they were tinkering with challenges in injecting 64-bit processes from 32-bit modules. And they started moving that into their code later in 2018. So their use of Metasploit has been documented publicly, but specifics like this just aren't necessarily available. So that's interesting, and it also is interesting because it overlaps with what those guys are doing with Carbon. They're also delivering things with Meterpreter and components from the Metasploit project. Real quickly, I want to mention WhiteBear precedes all this activity. And this is where we see some initial funky JavaScript or JScript that they're delivering and using for spear phishing targets. So this is prior to the iced coffee and KopiLuwak stuff. So it's loosely connected through this new scripting. But one thing we also saw, and here's simply some more of their JScript that they use in order to deliver droppers to a system. Another interesting point about WhiteBear is that back in 2017, both WhiteBear and KopiLuwak were sharing the same command and control server of a compromised WordPress site that they commonly use. So it is tied.
Of course, it's not a good technical presentation unless you have some eye chart that nobody in the back can read, so I had to include one. So this is the unobfuscated version of an early iced coffee sample, just kind of show you. It's a little daunting at first, but as you can see, that first function at the top basically is a decoder for all of the remaining lines, or at least a first stage decode. Turla loves to have multiple levels of decoding and various levels of base64 and RC4 and all kinds of crazy stuff they come up with for obfuscating their scripts. But it's really not a fairly a simple decode loop. And then you can see it applies to all those lines below that first loop, all the this, whatever, and then the escape text, and then the arguments that are passed for the math functions. And then that's kind of what it looks like after the first level of decoding. You can at least get a good idea what the script's doing. You see the C2. I actually cleaned that up a little bit to make the colors better. I stuck some quotes in there and stuff to make a little more readable. But typical of Turla, almost all the C2 are compromised legitimate servers. Iced Coffee has, some samples have like up to a dozen or so different C2s they use. Obviously, compromised sites, you don't know how long you're going to have control over them. So it's a decent practice. And then at the bottom, you can see the actors do call it Shirami. I think that there is a version 1.0.1001. Was obviously the first one we saw. I think 1.004 is the most recent I've seen. If anybody has anything later than that, I'd love to see it. Network traffic. This is that first beacon that's generated by the macro code itself. It's not actually iced coffee. The interesting part is at the end of the get line, you can see there's a little bit of of data, that's that basic amount of system profiling I mentioned, whereas the x may equals x, and then that next number is the process ID of wscript.exe that's running. It should be running the backdoor. The next bunch of bytes are just a series of queries about different registry settings and things. And then that last word before the JPEG is the first two characters of the host name, the username, and then the domain, or some combination of those three, just a somewhat unique identifier for the machine that it's running on, so that they could obviously use that to compare against the beacon once, if and when the actual JavaScript backdoor starts working. Oops. And here is the actual beacon for the malware itself. Really interesting bit here is that set cookie session equals. If you base 64 decode that is the RC4 key, which is then used for the payload, which is all of that system information that, the WMI queries that it runs to generate a big JSON file that then it RC4 encrypts and then base 64 encodes and sends it up. So nothing super fancy there. The most recent KopiLuwak that we saw was late this summer, or early this summer. It was kind of interesting. We only saw 2 targets, scientific, energy kind of targeting, government related, but not specifically government, in Syria and Afghanistan. So 2 very interesting targets. And the way this works, it was a zipped link, with a CV, with a document, or a CV.doc or CV. One was disguised as a resume, one was disguised as a spreadsheet. And then within that, there's PowerShell within the link file, which you can see is encoded. First level of encoding, just simple base 64. Within that, there's more PowerShell, which does the actual carving the payload out of the link file itself. Writes it to disk, all that. There's just multiple levels. Here you can see it'll write office.js to disk, and then the decoy doc list.xls gets displayed to the end user to look like it actually did something valid. Here's some of their code. So what the office.js does is it does all of the system profiling commands. It sets up persistence. In this case, it uses it sets up a logon task that runs immediately and then every 10 minutes. So that'll keep, maintain the persistence and keep it running. And then it also writes out this, you see that app data roaming Microsoft checkdisk.js. That's the actual payload itself. And then that persistence, that scheduled task will run checkdisk.js with a passphrase, which is the RC4 key that it uses to decrypt. When checkdisk runs, there's an RC4 encoded blob in the middle. It is actually the money part of the payload. And here is a sample of the Kopi network traffic. A little bit different than some of the early versions actually had a per user unique user agent. The latest version got rid of that. It looks a lot more legit. Again, compromised C2 infrastructure, and I'm not going to go into the payload encryption is a lot more complicated than with Ice Coffee, and it was well documented by us, as well as proof point later on. So if you're interested, go check out those blogs. We have references at the end. What was really interesting is that about 2 weeks or so before we found these KopiLuwak being dropped by the link files, we'd reported on Zebracy using link files to drop their malware. And when we looked at it, that third layer in of code, you can see they're exactly the same. I think there's 1 or 2 words that have a slight case sensitivity difference, but all the variable names are the same. Everything else, it could be, obviously it looks like some kind of builder or some kind of tool that's generating these, because all you have to do is change the offsets in the payload, and it doesn't matter, it'll work from one to the next. But I hadn't been able to find any other samples that match these, so either they're sharing the same weaponizer tool, or they're, perhaps the Turla guys just actually saw the Zebra C1 in the wild and grabbed it and made their changes to it, or they're sharing tools or collaborating or buddies, or talked about it over beers one night or something. Who knows?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that overlap is fascinating. Haven't seen that before. So to wrap it up, there's some things that we expect to see on the malware set side and on the targeting set for the rest of 2018 and into 2019 from Turla. We're seeing increased open source tooling in malware. This is surprising from Turla, and this is the group who carried out Epic Turla and was deploying Snake, this incredibly complex root kernel mode rootkit for years, had hundreds of victims all over the world, really high profile, interesting targets, and they're moving to scripts and open source stuff. They're continuing to maintain and modify their older elegant code like the Carbon framework, but again, deployment is rare. We don't see a whole lot of this in the wild, but we do expect to see more of it. There are indications that we're seeing a limited subset of a new family of malware that we haven't really digested, but we do expect to see a new family towards the end of 2018. We don't expect to see a whole lot of zero-day from these guys. This is something they were capable of back in 2014, but maybe in the past year we've only seen a zero-day from them. Nothing in 2018, I don't think. No water holing, we haven't been seeing them, and certainly no kernel rootkits. So something is shifting and changing within the group, but they're shedding all of their older skin. And then the newer stuff that we may not be seeing, that there's a lot of speculation about why we might not be seeing some of the newer, more complex stuff from them. Well, maybe they're using BGP hijacks, bootkits, maybe they're down at the AMT level. We don't know, but it's possibly something we can't see, or some of the mobile exploitation that we hear about in the news. And as far as targeting goes, it's probably going to remain the same for the rest of 2018. The stands have always been a target of these guys. So all of Central Asia, sort of on a rotating basis, takes on targeting. And it seems to rotate throughout the year. All of these other regions in the world have been hotspots in 2017, 2018. We expect to see more of that into 2019. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Do you have any closing thoughts? Yep. All right. Thank you very much for your time. If there are any questions.
Okay, thank you, Koert.